You decide you're going to do this, you start to implement it. Like in the movie, it shows there was a lot of resistance to it, and it showed it didn't really pay off right away. So I'm just curious, like, did it work right away? And in your mind, like, because I think sometimes when we're trying to do something and you're like, this should work, but it's not working, is there a point where you, in your mind, where you said, I'll give it until this and this date or this game, and then I'm not going to do it? I mean, walk me through that.
No, and if you saw the clip, there was a quote. This quote, Brad Pitt got directly from myself and Paul, was, we were going to be card counters. And if you know anything about counting cards, first of all, you're not gambling. They get kicked out of casinos because they will win. They're leveraging their bets. But it only works if they do it every single hand. You can't sort of go back and forth. For us,
sometimes you count cards on one hand.
Yeah, that doesn't work that way.
Or you don't do it, so it has to be very consistent.
It's very ruthless in your bets, and you're leveraging your bets based on the point total in the deck. And running a baseball team was the same thing for us. First of all, we knew we could almost before the season predict based on the roster how many wins we're going to have. You know, there's a lot of variables that happen, injuries and things like that, but when that injury or player is replaced, you just put that into the model as far as projecting wins. So we sort of knew if we were a good team. And we also knew that if we were performing well and our record didn't show, if there were certain, I hate to use this term because it's a little overused, but there's certain key performance indicators that we knew that over time, if we just stuck with the roster, we would be fine. So we didn't have a timeline. We knew this is the way to put together a team, and we felt and we knew eventually we were going to be right. Mm-hmm. And so there was a few moves we made that trades that we made that maybe throw some meat to the public to make them think we were making changes. But when it came down to it, we were pretty disciplined in knowing, listen, we're going to be fine. We're not going to panic on this thing. And eventually, just like math, eventually our counting cards, it's going to normalize. The deck's going to normalize, and you're going to normalize the performance. And the other thing, we hear this all the time now. People think like I was a risk taker. Oh, you're such a risk taker. It was actually the opposite. Everything we did we were running a baseball team like an actuary sets insurance rates, and having the data and using the data to pick players for us is like having the answers on a math test. Why wouldn't we use it, and why would we go back to another way of doing it? And what I found over time was most people don't default to the quantitative state. Most people are emotional, right? And as soon as you go to a quantitative decision-making process, your staff, when you're right 3 or 4 times in a row, they're all on board, right? As soon as you're wrong, everybody, I told you that number stuff doesn't work. In fact, in today's world, and I'm sure this room knows it, everyone's a data person, right? Until it doesn't back up their opinion. Yeah. And it's that discipline that you have to have. For us, data isn't an opinion, it's a fact.
Right.
And I've been in the room with really smart people who say they're data-driven, and they say, well, that data's right, that data's wrong, and that one's wrong. And we'll go like, well, you don't get to have an opinion whether it's right or wrong. It's a fact. And so the real leadership comes into play when you, like when you're counting cards. Listen, you lose 5 hands in a row, to have the guts to triple down on your next bet, that's where the leadership comes in. Mm-hmm. And that's where I think the Rubicon is everyone has access to data. Executing on that data is really where, again, the leadership comes in.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about how you cut through all the noise in the data, because there's so many data points that you could look at. The people in the room, I think, first of all, you have to decide what is winning. You have to have a definition of what winning is. And then how do you back off of that and say, what are the data points that lead to that help me win? How do you...
No, that's right. There's so much data out there. There's a lot of noise cutting. Some data means nothing. Mm-hmm. For us, we wanted the most, listen, when I say on-base percentage now, that was a statistic. What happened in baseball and in businesses now is that, for us, a statistic was low-hanging fruit, and everything in the book Moneyball was public information. We invented nothing. We stole every idea. Mm-hmm. But we knew that when the book came out, and eventually, because it wasn't proprietary, that bigger, smarter teams were going to say, hey, we agree with you. We got more money. We're going to do it better. And that's kind of what happened. The Red Sox came in and said, yeah, on base is a good way to go. And on base percentage in 1 year went from the 9th highest paid skill to the highest paid skill. Mm-hmm. Because it was public. What we also knew, again, going forward was that we weren't going to be able to hold on to this. We didn't invent this. Bill James said this was all out there. What we started doing, though, was collecting data, because we knew if we collected data, we would actually, by hiring a bunch of young, really smart young men and young women, we were able to use this data to create our own player performance models that would actually measure process, which we thought was a better way of evaluating a player's performance and therefore their future performance.
When you say process, what do you mean, measure process?
Well, I'll give an example. A statistic's a result, okay? And see if I try not to get too baseball wonky. If you're watching a baseball game and you're watching your favorite hitter and he breaks his bat, but he gets a single, he gets on base. Well, if you break your bat on every time you swing the bat, 99% of the time it's going to be an out. If you get lucky and it becomes a hit, your statistic is rewarded for what normally would be a bad process, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Okay, another example, if you're watching a game and hitter comes up and he hits a hard line drive and a guy makes a diving catch. Well, normally if you hit a line drive and a guy has to make a diving catch, more often than not, that process would have been rewarded with a hit. The fact that somebody made a great catch, you had a little bit of bad luck. So for us, we wanted to measure somebody who had good process in the game because we thought that that would lead to more consistent results, if that makes any sense. And statistics, in many cases, rewarded a process that might have been benefited from luck, if that,
okay.
Does that make so? After the book came out, teams started chasing stats. We started chasing really smart young men and women to take advantage of all this data to create our own proprietary models that we didn't have to share with the rest of the league. Gotcha. And so did other teams as well.
Were they measuring your team? They were looking at other players, though, not
the whole league. We want,
yeah,
because ultimately that's the pool of talent that we're ultimately dealing with. We really want to look at the whole league because for us, in Oakland we acquire players vis-a-vis trade. We don't necessarily sign them free agency because we can't afford to get in an open auction. So for us, we were evaluating the whole league and actually watching every single game and every event that happened between the white lines. We were collecting information on that. And really smart people will tell you, give them a lot of data, they can give you really good models. The more data you give them, the more models that they're going to come up with.
Right. Well, and guys, if you want to ask questions, just go to the mic so I know that you want to ask a question. We'll talk a little bit about team culture because Rob Patterson asked you this question on the pre-conference, and I thought the answer was really good because you're looking at just data and you're saying, how do we build a team based on the data and the facts? But I think all of us kind of feel like team culture matters. Like it's culture fit too. Yeah. So talk about that.
Well, let me start.
Does it not matter? Or
no, it does matter. I mean, it makes for listen, culture is just really a result of having success. I mean, you can start out having a great culture and throwing all these great parties, but essentially you're not having success. Mm-hmm. That culture starts to die. Baseball team is exactly the same thing. But before I go to that, I want to explain. The one thing that we found when the book came out, there was this sort of internal fear in the game that because we were making these ruthless decisions with data, I mean, people just generally get insecure about that, particularly the department that we relied upon to make scouting decisions, where now we're going to, what was interesting was when the book came out, they thought that we were going to eliminate that department. What happened was that actually those departments got larger. What we did was we just redefined their jobs. We thought it was impossible to send, a scout out to go watch a 17-year-old kid and predict in 1 hour how good that kid was going to be as a player in 10 years. Mm-hmm. But what he could give us that spreadsheets couldn't was ground intelligence. What kind of kid was he? What kind of family was he? All those things that we were able to put, smart guys were able to put into the models. And actually, as a result of the book, the fear that the department was going to be gone, it actually increased and tripled in size because the game became very information driven. And I think most people, there's a fear when you go through a big change that, which is natural, that how does this affect me? And it really impacted in a good way, scouts because we wanted as much information as we could have. So anyways, I want to make sure. But you talk about culture. So here my experience, Robin, is that we had a lot of really good teams in Oakland, and we had some teams that weren't not so good. And I will just say, a baseball team is like a business, except way more intense because you've got 25 guys dressing next to each other, like right next to each other. Their lockers are right here every single day. And when you're winning, everyone's going to make a lot of money next year. Everyone's having a great time, right? And so everyone's generally in a good mood. That culture is really positive. when you're losing games and you're not playing very well and you're dressing that, everyone's really irritable. And and you start people snipping the press. So my experience is I've never had a team that was really bad, say lost 90-something games, and at the end of the year, we all looked at each other and we go, we really stunk this year, but we had a great culture. We're going to bring everybody back and do it again. Usually, you're cleaning the house. And on the flip side, when you're winning a lot of games, people love each other. You watch the Super Bowl come up, you'll see it. It happens in football a lot, but it happens in every sport. The champion will say, we weren't the most talented team, which is usually not the case. They usually are. That's why they're there. Or they're one of the most talented teams.
Sure.
But we loved each other, and that's why we won. And usually you loved each other because you were winning. If you were losing, you would not be loving each other.
Yeah, they would be
Yeah. So,
no, and I think that's important.
Again, that's my experience.
No, I think that's, you're right, because I think as the leader of a company, you have to set the pace and the tone, and when things are bad, people know. Like if customers aren't happy and employees aren't happy and you're running tight on the budget and all these things, I think it does erode culture in this, but it also affects people's mindset. So if you can get a company to be winning, people want to be part of a winning team. I mean, it's just simple as that.
And ultimately, a winning team, everyone's rewarded.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, we all work because we're trying to make a living for ourselves and people
win.
around us. And the greater, the more we're compensated, not always, but we're generally happy, and that's a very motivating force. So,
Sure.
And when you're not succeeding, you've got your resume going, you're sneaking that out, you're closing your door,
Yeah,
and you're
because this
pointing
place
fingers.
might go, exactly.
Yeah.
This place might go belly up, and
Yeah, no, that's my culture experience. I mean, winning, making money. I mean, the other thing was interesting when we started all this, before the book ever came out, was during the .com era, right? We were in the Bay Area, okay? And there's a couple things that were going on at that time. First of all, the Bay Area at that time was probably the most, from an economic standpoint, the most exciting period in the history of the world. When you think of all the companies that came out, and here we were right in the middle of it with the A's, right? And there was a couple of things that had a huge impact on us was, first of all, you had the .com that kind of dove. You had pets.com, you had people skateboarding to work, the whole new paradigm for how you work. But then at the end of the day, guys like Warren Buffett go, there's really no business here, it's just a .com. And so rational thinking Buffett, that was the one year, I think it was 99, the 1 year Berkshire Hathaway lost money was, I think, 99 when Buffett said, this doesn't make sense to me. And then he turned out to be right. Mm-hmm. And it was ironically, we were reading a lot of Buffett at the time because we were trying to figure out what was going on too. And it was this sort of irrational behavior that was happening there. And we were right, we weren't a part of it, but we were living right there in the epicenter of it. And it had a huge impact on us, actually.
Yeah, well, and then that's a perfect example of gut feel and excitement taking over data, because they were looking at, how does this business make money? And it doesn't, and so.
And then the adult Warren Buffett said, it doesn't make sense to me, and then, he was right.
Yeah, right, emperor has no clothes. Yeah. All right, let's go over here, we'll take some questions, guys.
Perfect. So, you're talking a lot about culture and how really culture is developed by winning, but in the beginning you didn't have that winning. You didn't have winning going forward. So how do you convince people? So we're kind of in a situation right now with AI and trying to convince our clients that they should start adopting AI and getting it in their business. And you can kind of see that the numbers say it should work, but nobody's really seeing a ton of success with that yet. So how do you make those first initial steps to start getting yourself in a position to start winning so you can start changing that culture?
Yeah, well, the advantage, one of the things that was advantage about in my world, in baseball world, when we made decisions, it was all basically gut feel, right? Try to explain from a leadership standpoint. If you tell your whole staff every time, well, how did you come up with this? You go, I just had a gut feeling. It's a little shaky foundation, you might get lucky on 4 or 5 decisions, and then people think you're like some clairvoyant, person that sees the future. But the fact is by and large, when people think you're guessing, there's not a lot of confidence. They're maybe celebrating those guesses. But the great thing about using data for us, and AI is just taking it to another level. We essentially, when we were making decisions as a group, we could explain why we were doing something. It did not mean we were going to be right every time, but we knew that the hardest thing I found as a leader with with your people who work for you is they may not agree with you, but if you tell them why you're doing something, it's much easier to lead. When you let them fill in the vacuum and guess why you're doing something, that makes for a challenging leadership position. We're using data. We say we're going to do this because if we do this, it should happen here. Now, it doesn't always, but when it doesn't, then you can go back to your staff and say, let's analyze this. This is why we made the decision. Let's see why it did not work. When you're making gut feel decisions, you don't have the opportunity to really go back other than to think, hey, I just felt like it was going to work. So from a leadership position, I found data much easier form of decision making to lead or to explain to people as opposed to gut feel. AI is just taking it to the next level. It's just a decision making tree based on all this information. And again, with AI, it was like a little bit like with data in baseball, is that if you aren't, your competitors are. And I mean, I've had baseball teams. There's baseball teams that right away got on the train, right? And they were teams like Tampa, ironically the Yankees. They were right there with us, and in some cases surpassing us. And then there was a few teams that relied strictly on capital to be successful, and over time, even that capital didn't allow them to be successful, and they were so far behind. And it's funny, I had a staff member 10 years, well, it's been about 7 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, before AI was the rage. He was a brilliant guy, and he was begging us to invest in AI when nobody knew what AI was. He wanted us to co-op with the Berkeley lab and invest like a $5 million R&D. And I said, we don't have $5 million for research and development here. But he knew at some point in baseball, he felt, and I think he's going to be right, that AI would actually, some of these decisions we do make even with data are going to be spit out with AI. And when it comes to drafting 16-year-old kids or signing 17-year-old kids, this is my opinion. I think some teams are probably doing it now. We just don't know about it. So.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, let's go here.
Actually, I have two questions.
Oh, no, you only get one.
Well, that's Mr. Robin Cole. So he actually, out of everybody in the room, he is permitted to have two, yes, and nobody else.
What if I don't like the first one? Do I have to go to the second one?
You operated at Oakland in a small town, and at the disadvantage that football makes all the teams have the same amount of money.
Yeah.
But Oakland was a small town, and you had to play against people like the damn Yankees that had huge budgets. And the way you made money was to follow Warren Buffett's rule: buy cheap, sell high. You took players that were sort of the scum out of the bag that met your criteria, and then they rose to stardom and you sold them. In that process, this audience, you know your audience, we're all driven on data. But data was only one of three things. Creativity and mutual respect are all key ingredients with data that I'd like you to describe where, don't start, I have a second question. Mutual respect, where does mutual respect fit into that equation? Now, the second question, after you were so successful, you then were offered the job to go cure the curse of the Bambinos, and you turned that job down. So maybe you'll tell us at that moment why that happened after you tell us about how mutual respect fit in your equation.
No, just to make sure I answer as accurate as possible. When you say mutual respect as it relates to dealing with peers or dealing with players, or I just want to make sure I understand it correctly.
I'm not exactly sure. When I read about you, it said creativity, mutual respect, and data were the ingredients of your success.
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't write that one. So two of the three, I'm on board.
He just like shat all over everybody. He's like, you guys are low level.
Well, let me see. I'll tell you what. Let me cram an answer in there that may or may not be part of it. Okay. And this may have nothing to do with what you were talking about. One of the unique things about at the beginning, like, was when the book first came out, we had a lot of opportunity to, because In baseball, for me there's 30 teams. So if I want a player, I have to, if you run the Yankees, I had to call you and we've got an exchange of goods, right? So in some sense, you've got to see the world probably differently than I do. Like if I like your player and you like mine, for me to give him up, I got to not like my player as much as I like yours. So it's more negotiation. And at the very beginning before the book came out, like we had a lot of teams that we could deal with because we were evaluating players with a different process. We were using data, and other teams were using scanner reports. So there was a wide open field of players. Over time, what's happened now, if you follow baseball closely, there's not that many trades anymore because you have 30 baseball teams that are really well run by really smart young men and young women, and they're all know how to value player performance. So I can't call you up because the player I like, you like just as much as I do. Whereas and over time, that's happened, has changed since the book has come out, which is why, and then you have a team like the Dodgers who are brilliant, who are ruthless with their data implementation, and they have a lot of capital, which is why they win 100 games every single year, because they kind of check every single box. And because of that, they get mutual respect. So, and that's kind of where the game's, what's going to happen, I think, in baseball, because I think teams are really, really well run. They're smart people that are running them, is you may have an efficient market where you actually, the payroll will determine where you finish because all teams are kind of running their business very similar in the same way. And you know, you've brought up one other point that's interesting. In today's world, when it used to be like in the 80s, there was this idea that if you ran the Kansas City Royals or the Oakland A's or a small market team, that it was easier. But by the time myself was entering the game, the internet was there. So there was no such thing as a small market. Everybody in the country knew what you were doing and what they were writing about you. So you really, if you're in a small market, you really couldn't hide. There was still a lot of press covering you. And what was unique about Oakland was we were a small market, but yet we had like a population center of like 7 million people with like 7 newspapers. We were a small revenue club in a large market, which really made it challenging because the expectations were that you should win because you have a big market, even if you don't have big revenues. That's what was really challenging. A real small market like Tampa, where they have very little revenues and a small town, it's growing, but small town relative to, say, the Bay Area.
So why did you turn down the job?
He asked me how to turn, you know, that was all personal. I had made one decision in my life when I was growing up. When I came out of high school, I was going to Stanford, and that's what I wanted to do. And when I was offered a lot of money, I decided to go professionally as an 18-year-old. And I don't regret it now. I'm happy the way my life turned out, but I do regret the experience of going to Stanford, which is really where I want. And I said I'd never make a decision based purely on money. And my whole family was on the West Coast. If I went to Boston, I wasn't planning on failing. So I didn't want to come back and have my parents go from 60 years old to 80 years old, and my daughter goes from 13 to 33, and I missed her life, and I'm a very wealthy man. Things turned out great for me, and it was really a personal decision. If you're a Boston fan, we say they got the right guy anyways. They hired Theo Epstein. They won multiple championships, and so I haven't regretted it since.
You trained him.
Well, I'd like to take credit for that, but Theo, I think, did it all on his own. So, but thanks for the compliment.
All right, go over here.
As a Red Sox fan, thank you. And so, but
Hey, I could still go there and screw it up for you. So.
they're doing a good job on their own, so they don't. I'm not sure they need any help. But in our world and many others, job scorecards are ways that you measure people's success or failure in their jobs. When you were building out those staff profiles, the team members, obviously on-base percentage was huge because that's how you score runs. But were there detractors that you would factor in where you could basically say, hey, everybody's out there trying to build an A team, but maybe you can have B's and C's as long as the right metrics are in place? And so were there ways that you've evaluated kind of like knockouts, like this person's a B here, they're an A here, but they're a D down there? If that D was in the wrong spot, immediately no.
It's actually a great question, and I don't know if I'm going to answer it right, but so running a baseball team, you have 25 guys, right? They all have their own data, right? And what's interesting is like when Barry Bonds was playing for the Giants, right? When he was at his heyday, from a data standpoint, he was so good that he alone pretty much would get you to the playoffs. I mean, it's a little hyperbole, but it wasn't completely false. His data was that good, right? And what's interesting about baseball team, we got this around when we won, in 2000, we won 3 years, we won 12, 13, and 14. By that point, the star players were the high on-base percentage, and they were also the high-paid guys. We couldn't get those guys anymore. What we then found was we kind of worked the reverse. We had 25 players. And if you have a star player who gets 500 at-bats and he's up here, and then you have another player who gets 500 at-bats and he's the worst player in the league, just that one player can basically take away all the value. It's like having a bad stock in your fund. So what we sort of found out about 12 was using data, we couldn't afford the star players. Everybody knew who they were. So we started saying, all right, let's look at the bottom of our roster. Let's make sure we have no bad players, and let's just make sure we have 25 players who are at least average or slightly above. And through that process, first of all, it was much easier now, if you're like a player like me, you're not making a lot of money and are easy to sort of move, and there's a lot more fungible, so to speak. So we had a lot more active roster on the bottom. We could do things with it. And all we made sure, like, you've got our 2012, 2013, 14, we ended up having some stars. But by and large, it was just a team of 25 guys who were average. We had no bad players to sort of bring down the performance. And then we started mixing and matching skills, to your point. We really started platooning, meaning like we would have a second baseman who was left-handed, who couldn't hit left-handed pitching, but was really against right-handers. And then we'd complement him with a platoon, a guy on the other side who would maybe play against right-handed pitching. And so we started mixing and matching, taking half a player and finding another good half and putting them together. And we had a lot more roster manipulation, and we're very active, and we were very successful, to your point, because when the book came out, the star players did get on base, and it ultimately cost a lot of money, and we were very quickly priced out of that market. So we had to find other ways of attacking our roster, and the way we did it was what, like you explained. So let's just take the bad players off. Forget the star players. Again, let's take the bad players, and let's take a player who's good at one thing and complement him with somebody who does the things that he doesn't do well. And if you look at our 2012 team, was predicted to lose like over 100 games, and we won 94 games, and then won the division 3 years in a row. And that's exactly how that roster was built. If that comes close to answering your question.
Thank you very much.
Great, yeah. And guys, the ones up here, this will be the last questions. And Austin, I need the timer back up if you don't mind, please. All right, over here.
Just a question. Were you ever afraid of failure?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think listen, I don't think listen, we knew it could happen, but we also, again, we felt like we had better information, and we felt the failure would come on because we didn't necessarily trust the data and pulled up on it. So we knew we were going to be right because we'd seen, again, it was like we could put it on a spreadsheet and said, if these guys do this and this and this, we'll be successful. So we really weren't. I wasn't really that, maybe it was just because I was young and full of hubris, but we felt like we were going to be right, which is why we kept doing what we're doing despite having a lot of noise and criticism when it wasn't initially successful. That's the thing about data. If the expectation is that, hey, you're going to be right every time. We knew we weren't going to be right. We just needed to be right more often than our competitors. And if the problem for us is if we interrupted that process before, too early, then we were going to fail. So in a weird way, we weren't really worried about it. Again, maybe it was youth and maybe it was hubris, but we felt like, hey, we're going to be right because this makes sense to us, and it was a rational way to doing things. It was, again, going back to Buffett, in fact, we're talking about Buffett, we read everything we could, and if you look at every line that Paul and my DePodesta, as we said, we would look at quotes from Warren Buffett, and he would say, investing is most efficient when it's most businesslike, and we would just substitute investing for baseball management, and everything he said made sense. And it was just a rational way of looking at things, and we tried to run our baseball team in a crude way like Warren Buffett invested. In fact, I said it so much I got the chance to sit down with Warren Buffett in Omaha one time. It was one of the greatest thrills of my life when he sat in his office and got to visit with him for an hour and a half because he knew what fans we were of his. Not that we're the only ones.
Well, then, if you don't mind, if I can ask another question. But what inspired you to be a baseball manager? Because my dad did tell me you were a baseball manager. So what inspired you to be one of the managers there?
Well, I came up playing the game as a kid, and it's funny. As much as I loved playing it, I really wanted to run, more than playing. I wanted to run my own team. I mean, I remember when we were like in the early '80s, before fantasy baseball, we had teammates. We created our own fantasy league. So the idea of running your own team and maybe owning your own team was really ultimately what I wanted to do. And I was really inspired when I saw the opportunity that was presented with the strategy that we ended up employing. I mean, somebody gave me the template, like Bill James gave me the directions to, hey, if you do this, you're going to be successful. So that was pretty exciting. And one of the first things I did when I got the position was hire Paul DePodesta, who was a non-traditional assistant general manager. He was a guy who was a Harvard econ major, and most guys in that position were ex-players like myself. So, and again, the template for running a baseball team comes from my own experience as a player, and then when Bill James and Pete Palmer wrote books and said, this is how you should do it, and nobody was doing it, that was pretty exciting for me. And they didn't disappoint with their recommendations.
Thank you.
All right.
So when you were running really hot and you were really successful and having a ton of momentum, the movie likes to talk about like the downward spiral, the valley, if you will. When you were running really hot though and things were going well, what was the habit or the skill set that served you the best?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Well, one of the things, weirdly, is you saw where I don't watch the games, right? Well, first of all, when you're in, the one thing is you get older, and Robbie Mayer, hopefully this is a good thing. When we first started, Paul and I were two of the youngest guys in the league in our position, right? And when we were having these hot streaks, at first, we thought we were the smartest guys in the room, right? Like, we're so smart, we're so good, right? Now, the longer you do any job, the more humble you become, right? So we learned that over time. In fact, I think the older you get, you kind of become so humble that you think you're getting, in a weird way, you feel like you're getting dumber because you're more respectful of competitors, therefore more open-minded, which I think comes with experience. But at the beginning, we thought...
You learn how much you don't, you start
yeah.
learning more and more, and you're like, oh, wow, there's so much I don't know.
Yes, yeah. When you're young and right all the time at the beginning, it can be overpowering to a little bit. I mean, you can get on a roll, but it's also at some point you're going to come crashing down. And not that we did, but the habit that I personally, just an actual habit, and it was in the movie, I did not watch the games. Right? I ran a baseball team and did not watch the games. And the first, well, how can you do that, right? Well, it's because I didn't want to make a decision emotionally by watching. There's 162 games. They're 3 hours on average every single night. You could play game 25 in May of that year and something happens in the 5th inning, a little micro event when you measure it against the season. If I watch that and it makes me really mad as the CEO of my baseball team, I can make a really emotional decision based on a micro event that will have no impact on the season, or will have an impact on the season. Wow. If I just leave it be, it probably doesn't end up one event that loses. It probably isn't going to hurt you at the end of the year. My reason for not watching the games was I have access to all the information through the data in the game after the game is over, just like you getting a quarterly earnings or something. And by then, hopefully I'm not emotional when I evaluate it. We either won and I'm happy and we lost, but I can see why. And hopefully as an executive, I would make better decisions, not driven by the emotion of losing a game. Because I'm telling you, when you run a baseball team every night, if you watch it and you lose a game in the 9th inning, you can go down to a locker room really angry and really mad and make a really bad decision based on that emotion that will impact the rest of the season. So I removed myself because I didn't want to get emotional. So that was a habit, and I used to pass that down to all the people. I said, Bob Melvin was our manager for 10 years, and we had a great run together. And I used to tell him, I said, Bob, I won't call you after a game, and whether we win or lose, just don't expect a call from me, okay? And I said, because 75% of what I would say as his boss after a game, I probably would take back the next morning if it was an emotional game. And it was a way of governing my emotions It allowed him time to wind down, and then when we wanted to discuss the game, we could do it the next day after we'd slept on it. It was a much healthier way. So that was one habit that I did, and quite frankly, and I think it was smart, actually. And I got a lot of friends now who have adopted that. So there's a lot of general managers out there who don't watch the games.
I'll steal it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice, because if you think about it, there are times when, I mean, that's one of the things I've learned, like when something happens in your business, I always think, okay, just,
You want to correct it,
well,
too.
yeah, give it 24 hours, calm down, look at it, get all the facts, make sure you understand everything before you respond.
No doubt.
Yeah.
And again, and sports is so intense and so emotional. I mean, think about it. Like, if I watch the game in a suite and the game's going on, as soon as the game's over, if you lose, like on an error or a bad play, you can immediately go down there. You got fans that are mad, and you're going through the crowd. You get down to the manager's office, he's mad. I mean, you can say some things that you definitely would not say if you slept on something. And so it just became and as I always said, I'm a much better father and husband when I don't watch the game. So that was the other thing, too.
Yeah, and Austin, if you want to bring that virtual question back up, I just needed to know where we were on time. But yeah, so and speaking of that, because when you're running a baseball team, it's very public if you're winning or losing. Like when we're running a private business, I mean, your competition might know, your employees, some people know, but in general, you're not having everybody watch you. So I know fans can be extremely passionate. Like, how did you deal with, the data's there, if you stick to this, you're gonna, like, talk about how you dealt with criticism and the passionate maybe hate that would come back.
Yeah, well, to be totally honest with you, my advice to Paul when he went, I didn't read the local paper. I mean, think about it. If in my job, and you're right. The one thing about baseball sports teams is that most people, people have a passion for it. Some people don't care about it at all, but most people are aware of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and a 6-year-old will have an opinion, and a 9-year-old will have an opinion. So if I make a trade of a player, or let's say A's have lost 5 games. Now, 5 games is a small sample size, 162 games, right? It really, I mean, good teams will lose 5 games in a row. But if I open up the paper and my kids are there eating breakfast with me, there's a columnist who's given an opinion on whether I'm doing a good job after 5 games. And if I've lost 5, I'm probably an idiot. Mm-hmm. And then when I get in the car to drive to work, there's a talk radio, 2 guys talking in the morning, talking about what an idiot I am as I'm driving to work. And then you guys are calling in to confirm I'm an idiot, right? And then there's this lunchtime guys, and then when you drive home from work, there's the drive time guys who are screaming it. And every town has it. If you live in Boston, it's WEI. If it's New York, it's WFAN. If you live in Columbus, Ohio State has got their own basically radio. That kind of noise, somebody calling you an idiot all day will affect your decision making. And when you come home and your kids go, Dad, why did you trade Josh Donaldson? Are you really that big of an idiot? I mean, your kids will say that to you. And so to be totally frank, I didn't read any of the paper. I was completely oblivious as to what was going on.
Wow. Yeah.
And it was a way of sort of protecting myself from not making decisions.
Deviating and
making like, oh, I don't want to be, because nobody likes to be called an idiot, right? Yeah, so I literally would just completely shut it out. It was a way of like helping, make sure that my decisions were not being driven by the narrative and the noise out there. And in sports, it's very much out there.
It's tough.
I mean, I've mentioned Ohio State. This is true. I'm not an Ohio State fan, but Ryan Day lost 3 or 4 games to Michigan. The guy had like a 70-6 record. And I'm going, they're talking about firing this guy. I mean, that's, and then he goes on and wins the national championship, right? And everything's fine, right? Until next year, if he loses to Michigan again. But if you really think about it from a rational decision making, that you have a coach, and again, I'm not an Ohio State fan, but I remember going, this guy's like, again, I was close, like 70-6 his whole career, playing in the playoffs. And they were talking about like,